Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. It's Jessica Ward King, the StigmaCrusher here. Today I'm a little scattered. I'm a little down. What I'm about to say is not for like, ooh, well done, Jess, or anything like that. This is kind of a PSA around mental illness and homelessness and addictions and just being human to one another. So this morning on my way to work, I jumped off the bus and found someone who had collapsed onto the ground. And there was evidence of drug use, but that's really not the issue. He wasn't breathing, and I watched as people walked by and looked at him in disgust and continued walking. Well-dressed people with cell phones in their hands just walked by. Of course, I immediately called 911 and they advised me to do CPR. I can tell you it's a lot different doing CPR on an actual person than it is doing it on those dummies that they give you at the classes. But even as I did CPR and asked passersby to flag down the ambulances that were coming, people still walked by looking at us in disgust. One guy came and said to me, "Are you okay?" And I'm like, "I'm fine. This guy's not so much okay. Can you please flag down the ambulance?" Which he then did do. And by the time the ambulance and fire and police got there, he was breathing. Thank God, this poor man. Um, and and when I was able to hand him over, he was breathing. So thank God. I'll never know what happened to him, but the reason that I bring this up on this channel is that, as I say, there was evidence of drug use present. He did have a naloxone kit in his coat, so I can only assume that addictions were an issue for this guy. And the chances are good that other mental health issues were also an issue for this guy, because we do know that mental illness is much, much higher in the homeless, unhoused, and street living populations than in other populations. And the reason for this is very, very complex. Partly, folks that are living on the streets have a really hard life. They have a really hard time. They end up turning to illicit substances, or even in some cases, legal substances, for relief from that pain and that dreariness and the hopelessness and the mental health issues. But partly also, folks that do have mental health issues end up unhoused and on the streets because of the inequities in our mental health care system. So it is a very complex interaction. It's not one or the other. It's both and plus a lot of other factors. So one of the factors is deinstitutionalization. It used to be that if somebody was struggling with severe mental illness, they were housed in an institution. Now, these institutions were not always fantastic. In fact, they were rarely fantastic. There were some barbaric practices that happened. There was some, particularly the ones that were kind of like publicly housed, that were not private. People were restraints were used, medical restraint and medication as restraint was used. So they weren't wonderful places to be, but they were roofs over heads. And in the 70s, when deinstitutionalization happened, that was when, people said, we don't want people living in these horrible conditions anymore. Let's have them come out of the institutions and let's give them services in the community. Let's have community housing that's available. Let's have community clinics. Let's have community mental health. Let's not have all the doctors, in the hospital, but let's have them instead in the community setting. And that was a great idea, except that it didn't happen that way. What happened is they shut the institutions because of the bad press and the ideas that people were having. They shut the institutions, and all of the people that were mentally ill and being housed in the institutions were put into the community. But the community was very slow to institute all of these community supports, so community housing, community care. And so you ended up with a great outflux of individuals into the community that then were not supported, that did not have care, that did not have housing. And so that started this cycle. And the cycle has really only continued. The housing and care that was promised with deinstitutionalization never really materialized, and the inequity just continued. And so you had a whole bunch of people that came out that weren't able to work due to disability, because, as we've discussed on this channel, mental illness, it can be a disability. It can be very, very disabling and can prevent a person from having meaningful employment. Then you had these folks that were unable to work. They didn't have what you would, typical community support. So even back before institutions, folks that weren't well were at least supported by their families and by their smaller communities, by churches, for example, or things like that. And once they had come out of institution, that didn't happen. They weren't reintegrated into the community. And so you ended up with this kind of community within a community of people that were struggling with their mental health, that couldn't support themselves or one another, and weren't being supported by the rest of the community. And so it's really just snowballed. And I mean, it's been 40 years since the 70s. Oh gosh, 50 years. I can't even count, since the 70s. And it really, like, in those 50 years, it hasn't gotten much better, unfortunately. And so you'll find that a lot of folks that are not only struggling with addiction, but with other mental health issues, do find themselves unhoused. We also have, like, I live in Ontario, and the Ontario Disability Benefit is, it will cover psychiatric medications, it will cover the cost of some housing, and a little bit left over for, like, food and stuff, but not a whole lot. Not everybody's able to get it. Not everybody is eligible for it. You do have to have an address to send. Like, so the inequities just compound, and I see it all the time. Folks that are struggling to continue to maintain their housing, just to continue to eat, that are on this disability benefit. So it's not really enough to live, and it's not enough to live this meaningful life. And if you do try to get out of, if you try to get gainful employment, they take it out of your disability payment. So if you get a job that's maybe part-time, because with your disability, that's really all that you can do. You can do a part-time job, but a full-time job is too much. If you make a certain amount, they take it out of your disability payment. So you never really get ahead. You can never get yourself out of that hole that you find yourself in, because you've been unwell and because you've been on disability. I don't know if it's different in other jurisdictions. I can't imagine that it's too much different, but perhaps it is, and maybe you can tell me. But it's really this trap that people find themselves in that they cannot get out of. So whether they're barely housed or unhoused, they can't get out of that level of poverty and that level of that lack of community care. And because of the stigma, it's even worse, because, I mean, people might help someone that's just poor, but if they have mental health issues, particularly if they have addictions issues, people see addictions as a choice. They see it as, well, you're choosing to take that substance or use those substances, you're choosing to be like that, and people are afraid. I mean, I know a lot of the folks that walked by that gentleman on the ground today saw drug paraphernalia, and I'm sure some of them were afraid. Still, they could have called 911 and said, I don't want to get involved. I don't want to touch this gentleman because I'm not sure if there are substances. That's still a possibility. It's still no excuse. But people are afraid of addictions. People are afraid of drugs. And they judge, and there's so much stigma around people who use substances. There's stigma around people with other mental health issues as well. And if you've got both, just, forget it. So the stigma compounds the issue. There's not a lot of empathy for these individuals. There's not a lot of care for these individuals. And I saw that firsthand today, and it's so frustrating. Like, I'm vibrating the way that I'm angry with humanity right now. Even though I understand where it's coming from, it's no excuse, but I get it, but I'm so angry because it shouldn't be this way. So this is the PSA. If you see somebody on the street and they look like they're struggling with a mental health issue or addiction, they're still a person. They're still somebody's son. They're still somebody's brother. They're still somebody's possibly father, uncle, friend. I mean, just they're a person. And I mean, if you're here on this channel, I'm probably preaching to the choir, but please stop and let's try to stop the stigma around homelessness, around addictions, around mental health issues, and around all of those things put together, and try to work to equalize this system that we have built that is not equitable, that is not fair, that doesn't allow these individuals to thrive, to survive. They can survive just barely, but thrive, no. So that's what I would argue for at this point, is let's make a system where people can thrive. Everyone has the opportunity to thrive. That's it for me this week. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you in my next one. Bye.
Stigma Crusher.